Welcome to Workplace Wake Up, your go-to podcast for practical employment law guidance. I'm Jennifer Shaw, the founder of Shaw Law Group, and I'm here to help HR professionals and leaders navigate the legal minefields of the modern workplace. Each week, we tackle real-world issues with clear advice and a little tough love. Let's get started. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the podcast. I'm so happy you're here with us today. April is a crazy month. Today is April Fool's Day, and it is hot already in Sacramento, which I cannot believe, but okay. As you know, we had a very strange sort of winter season, if you can call it that, around the globe. So here we are, and all I can do is think about how the 100-degree weather is coming. I'm going to try not to think about that and enjoy the month of April. So very happy to be here with all of you. We're going to talk about employment references. Why? Because I have had so many calls about this issue in the last couple of months. And it's interesting how there's a real tension between the advice that a lot of people give in this area and the actual law in this area. And I want you to think about why human resources folks struggle, because there's a lot of fear. There's a lot of inconsistency. There's pressure about, do I provide a reference? Do I not provide a reference? Here's what I want you to know. You can absolutely give references, and I think you should. My own view on this is that we owe it to each other to be able to provide references so that we can make good hiring decisions, so people can trust us, so they can understand what we're going through as employers. If we don't help each other in the employer community, we're really at odds with each other by definition, right? So if we can provide this information, get everybody going in the right direction, it really does make a huge difference. Having said that, everyone you talk to who's been in HR for more than 10 years will tell you about a lawsuit they dealt with that involved references. So there is a lot of mystique out there about whether you should give employment references, or should you just take this sort of approach of, I'll just give what we call neutral references, right? A neutral reference is one that doesn't say anything about their performance, but it says Jen has worked here since June of 2006. She has been an attorney, and her starting pay was X, and her current or last pay was Y, and there we go. Like, that's really what we mean by a neutral reference. What's the problem with a neutral reference? Well, the problem is it's unhelpful. I mean, I guess, sure, you can document that somebody was at the firm they said they were at for the period of time they said they were there doing the job they said they were doing. It's not that that's not helpful. That is sort of first line helpful, right? But the next thing you want to do is find out, okay, how did the person do at the job? Were they good at what they were supposed to be doing? And that is where we get all this contrary advice, or I shouldn't say contrary advice, conflicting advice, where you'll have some folks feeling really strongly that they want to provide substantive references, and other people saying, yeah, no, I wouldn't do that if my life depended on it. All I do is confirm name, rank, and serial number. So I want to talk to you about the law a little bit and tell you why I think you should be giving references. If you are a member of Employers Lawyer, you may recognize this topic from our office hours that we had a couple of weeks ago, where Joe Beachboard and I actually debated this issue. It was pretty interesting. You might want to go listen to it. But what I want to talk to you about now is, what's the legal framework? What are your risk areas? And what do we want to be doing here? All right. So first thing I want you to understand is there is a law in California that gives you what's called a qualified privilege. It's Civil Code Section 47C. And what it says basically is, if you're answering questions about somebody, it's not specific to references, by the way, but it's specific to communications. And what it says is, if you're answering questions or you're providing information about an interested party, right, somebody like a former employee, then you are privileged to say whatever you want to say as long as it's the truth. So in other words, the idea is, look, if you're going to answer a question like, would you rehire this person? And you decide, actually, I don't want to rehire this person. You would be privileged to say, I wouldn't rehire this person, meaning you can't be sued for saying that under most circumstances. Now, what I want you to understand about Section 47C of the Civil Code is that it is what's called a qualified privilege. And by the way, many other states have these kinds of provisions. So even if you're listening today and you're not a California HR professional, this concept is present in a lot of different jurisdictions. So the idea is you have a qualified privilege. So you have the ability to answer questions truthfully as long as you don't engage in conduct that is based on malice. In other words, are you purposely lying about somebody's work performance with you because you want them to not be able to get a job? You have a bad motive. That's what we mean by malice. And obviously, if you're doing that, you're not going to be privileged. So if you're acting with malice or you're acting in a way that doesn't show that you did your homework, right? Did you make sure that the statements you're making are supported? So for example, you don't want to say, yeah, we fired Jen because she was a liar. Okay, well, what did she lie about? Well, is it really that she lied? Did she just not answer a question you wanted her to answer? What happened? You've got to be clear about what you're going to say to these references so that you can really stay on the right side of all this. And the right side of it is making sure that you are being honest, that you're being fair, that you're giving this former employee a fair shake. So the privilege can be lost when you are acting reckless or when you have not dotted your I's and crossed your T's in terms of the information that you're providing to the other individual involved. Now, for most of us, of course, and I think this is probably all of us, we don't want to make it hard for someone to get another job, right? We felt bad enough that we had to fire them or that they quit, and we don't want to make it hard for them to get another job. So we struggle with that part where we want to say, well, I know there were a couple of bad things about Jen, but overall, she was okay. And you don't want to tell them the bad things because you want to help Jen get a job. The problem is you've got to be honest. And you can't say anything that is either overly positive without support or overly negative without support. Because keep in mind, a lot of people think of this issue as, I'm going to get sued because I didn't give someone a great reference and now they're not going to get a job. Sure, that's a risk. But I'll tell you what else is a risk. You go on and on about how great somebody is, even though you knew full well at the time you made those statements that they'd been investigated for theft in your company. And now they go to the new company who relied on your reference and the employee steals from the new company. Now the new company comes back to old company and says, hey, you told me this was a great employee. It turns out he's a thief and you knew he was a thief. How do I know that? Because he told me he got in trouble for stealing when he worked with you. So you have to be very, very careful that you're doing your homework and that you are giving information that is accurate and that you have actually looked into, that you know is accurate information. Now, what are your actual risk areas? Okay. Well, first of all, defamation. Okay. Defamation is when you write something or you say something that is untrue. And not only is it untrue, but it tends to harm the individual's reputation about whom you made the statement, right? Or you wrote the statement. So defamation is a big fear for a lot of employers. I will tell you, it is very hard to prove because it requires a false statement, a fact that you're not stating it as an opinion, and that it's provably false to the individual's reputation. Those are the things you have to prove for defamation. Hard to prove, okay? But it can happen. Retaliation. Somebody speaks up about an issue in the workplace and then they're fired 2 days later. Now, we're going to say as the employer, well, we fired this person 2 days later because we were actually already in the process of making the decision to terminate them. And that's actually why they made a complaint. They made a complaint because sometimes the best offense is a good defense, right? Or the best defense is a good offense. So in this case, retaliation comes because the person is saying, oh, wow, I complained and then you fired me. Well, we have to be able to show, no. We were already in process to fire you when you made this complaint. In fact, that's why we think you made the complaint, right? You were trying to head this off. Still, you've got to have proof. You've got to have documentation to be able to defend those types of claims. Then you have discrimination risks, right? Forget about retaliation. You've got the risk that somebody says, hey, you gave Jen a reference, but she's a woman. You give all of the females references, but you don't give the males references. Why not, right? Or you only give people of a certain racial background or a certain religious belief a reference. Obviously, you've got to be fair. You've got to be consistent. You've got to do this right all along the way, right? You cannot be showing preferential treatment or favoritism when you're giving references. Now, the thing is, a lot of these claims, defamation, retaliation, discrimination, they come because a manager or supervisor has engaged in a conversation that they thought was off the record. So they tell an employee, the employee says, oh yeah, I saw you interview Jen. Are we going to give her an offer? And the manager goes to that employee and says, look, off the record, I want to tell you, no way am I going to give her this job because I know she sued her last employer. And so she's going to be coming after us too. That kind of a statement is often the smoking gun evidence of defamation, right? Or of retaliation or discrimination. So we have to be very, very careful what we're saying about people once they've been exited. And you may have thoughts in your mind about how glad you are that they aren't there, or maybe they did steal money from you. And so you feel like you're just so relieved that they're not in that role anymore. I get all that. But for the public consumption, and this includes your own staff, so-and-so's moved on, right? And we wish her all the best. Now, if you want to make a point, let's say there really was theft and you want to make a point, you got to be really careful about saying, I fired so-and-so because she stole from us. You better be right about that. So that's one of the reasons why people worry about references. They just say, what the heck? It's not worth the risk. I'm just going to not give references. But of course, the problem with that is you don't give references. It's going to be hard for you to get references. And you want references when you're hiring a new employee. Okay. So when you talk about the risk area here, whether it's defamation, retaliation, discrimination, you've got to think about these off the record conversations that supervisors and managers have. They will often tell someone else, this is off the record. Don't talk about it. I just need to vent. I just need to let you know about this. We got to tell folks you cannot do that. The managers and supervisors should definitely not be doing that. Now, of course, there's an obvious reason why, right? Because that's going to be your evidence of the defamation, the retaliation, and the discrimination. Now, practically speaking, what do you do? Well, first of all, I am of the mind that you should give references, and they should be substantive references, right? They should be, yeah, Jen worked here for 12 years. She wrote really good articles. She did a good job in the 2 trials we went to. She was a very effective litigator. She's got some opportunity areas. She doesn't always communicate as clearly as we would like, but I think she learned that as she was going on, right? Well, you know, whatever it may be that you're going to say about Jen, you want to think it through and you want to understand, okay, if somebody's going to call me for a reference, I have to think about what I'm going to say. And it's very easy when this situation is, we have an individual who's going away to college. They're not going to work with us anymore, but they are going to need some college work. And we're happy to call on their behalf and say, gosh, this kid left for college. She was so amazing. He was so terrific. And we're so happy that you might be able to offer them some kind of a role. Okay? So the first thing we've got to do is really make sure that we've centralized the process so that any reference for checks come into HR, come into the owner, for example, not to each individual supervisor and manager, because we don't know what they're going to say. We don't have a way for them to track what's happening. We want to train everybody to say, hey, I can't do references, but HR would be happy to talk to you, right? And I'm going to give you the number so you can reach them. We also have to make sure we're using documentation appropriately. When you call to have a talk with an employee who wanted a reference, where are you writing it down? Where are you storing that information? Can other people access it? Some people probably need to be able to access it, right? But you want to make sure that the wrong people aren't accessing it. So that's going to be important. And then consistency is critical, right? You can't give a, quote, personal reference. That doesn't exist. If somebody worked for you or with you, any reference you give them is a work reference, all right? So you've got to train your leaders, your managers, your supervisors to know that and understand that. And they have to understand they've got to be consistent, right? They have to be sure that if they give references to everybody, because that's what ends up happening, right? Is we end up getting that discrimination side of things that we have to be careful about. So here's the bottom line on references, you guys. You can give references. You just have to do it in a way that is correct, right? What you don't want to be doing is creating liability for yourself. That's the problem. That's the bottom line. So that's what I want you to focus on when we talk about these references, is that you are giving them the information, the prospective employer, the information they need to be able to do their job, but you're not creating liability for yourselves. All right? So this is a fun topic. Go out, take a look at how you guys are handling references, figure out what you want to do. There are pros and cons to both approaches, right? But once you decide what you're going to want to do, stick with it. Make sure you've got procedures in place so everybody understands how the process is going to work if you decide to give references. And even if you don't, you're still going to need a process if you don't give references. All right, everybody, thank you so much for joining me today. Keep up the good work, and I'll see you next week. Workplace Wake Up, including our guests and hosts, do not provide legal advice in this podcast. Do not act upon any of the information discussed in this podcast without first consulting a licensed attorney in your jurisdiction. Thank you for joining me on this episode of Workplace Wake Up. If you found today's discussion helpful, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share the podcast with your HR and leadership teams. For more insights, training programs, and legal updates, you can visit us at shawlawgroup.com.